Good day, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's issue, we're going to continue coverage of the ongoing crisis between Ukraine and the West and the Russian Federation. And we're going to look at both kind of how we got here, and we're going to look at history. And we're also going to look at some of the current news and events that are taking place that are coming out of some of the mainstream and not so mainstream media outlets in regards to the situation between Ukraine and Russia. So first, we'll start off with the news. Miami Herald. Putin, Russia will submit security proposals to U.S. in a week. The Hill. Expect shock and awe if Russia invades Ukraine. Stripes, how the U.S. military could mobilize if Russia invades Ukraine. CNBC, Biden didn't accept Putin's red lines on Ukraine. Here's what that means. Fox News, whether he attacks Ukraine or not, Putin has already won. CNBC, Biden says U.S. won't send troops unilaterally to defend Ukraine against Russia. And ABC News, Biden warns of severe consequences if Putin moves on Ukraine. So again, the situation continues, the crisis continues, the rhetoric continues, the positioning of forces also continue by the Russian Federation. So if we look at this, and I've talked about this in the past in terms of what is Russia's biggest concern about Ukraine, about NATO membership, about this supposed defensive-only alliance. That is the rebuttal by the United States, by the West. The outlook, the opinion is that Ukraine should have the ability to join NATO, as NATO is just purely a defensive organization. So let's talk about that real quick. That is not true. NATO is not simply just a defensive organization, and we'll look at that, and we'll start as we continue to see NATO expansion into areas where many years ago, Secretary of State Baker had said the United States would not enlarge NATO towards the east. And obviously, we have seen the Baltic states become parts of NATO. We've seen Poland, Czech, Slovak republics, Hungary, Romania, and again, it continues. And Russia's big concern, obviously, is that Ukraine could achieve NATO membership, and at one point we were also seeing, obviously, destabilization efforts. Whether we like to admit it or not. Okay. Belarus is seen very close. The current leadership within Belarus is seen very close to the Putin circle, and the West would like, as would many people inside of Belarus, would like to see that authoritarian regime come to an end. And obviously, that regime in Belarus has become closer, given the Union state ties and the current situation with the Russian Federation. But if we look back in history, if we start where we first saw the North Atlantic Treaty Organization transform from just a purely defensive organization that was really designed initially to defend Western Germany and Western Europe from Soviet aggression. Okay, and it achieved that goal. The Soviet Union collapsed, and instead of going dormant, it expanded. NATO expanded. And we really first saw the first offensive operation by NATO take place in Kosovo. Kosovo, a portion of that region which has been traditionally part of Serbia, has or did rebel against the Central Serbian, aka Yugoslavian, government, as did a host of other regions within the former Yugoslavia. But what's different with Kosovo is this had always been part of Serbia proper. It was never its own independent or its own semi-autonomous region in past history. Through migration and immigration, some of the demographics changed within Kosovo, and that allowed separatist movements in Kosovo to emerge, which led to a conflict, an internal conflict, which required an internal security operation by Serbia, and that led to a fairly aggressive NATO operation against Serbia over Kosovo. So that was the first time we really saw NATO take a offensive or an aggressive stance on a certain geopolitical situation that really is not Western Europe. And the Kosovo situation and the activities of the United States and NATO by engaging Serbia, attacking Serbia over Kosovo, led to probably more destabilization and the prospect of an actual greater war because of that operation. Again, that was not a defensive operation. Again, Western Europe, nor any other sovereign state, was at risk by what was going on internally inside of Serbia. So whether you agree with some of the methodology, some of the methods that and the tactics that Serbia was using against Kosovo is irrelevant. It was an internal issue, and it was turned into something different and very risky. And unfortunately, because of the situation inside of Russia at the time, Russia was very, very weak in 99, 98, 2000. That allowed NATO to take that action that it took in Kosovo. So that was the first time that Russia had a good look at what NATO was capable of doing outside of the auspice of defense. Okay? Make that very, very clear. It went on the offense because it did not agree with what Serbia was doing internally with Kosovo. Again, what was going on makes no difference. It was not within the scope of NATO authority to intervene on a non-NATO member the way it did. Next, we saw Libya. Civil war in Libya. Whether you like the Gaddafi regime or not, again, and this isn't even in Europe. Again, we observe NATO, okay, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, taking conducting an operation in North Africa. Again, no European country was at risk. There was no conflict in Europe, but NATO, the United States, the Obama administration, under the guise of nation building and another really miscalculation, utilized NATO assets to overthrow the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. And again, that further exacerbated the concern that Russia had that when you say NATO is purely a defensive organization, as it continues to expand east, caused Russia great concern. Not that there was the possibility that NATO would attack Russia. What Russia was seeing was a very opportunistic organization, meaning that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had become passive-aggressive and extremely aggressive when it felt that it had the opportunity to do so. Now, granted, most likely the real reason that it operated in Libya was not the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, but it was obtaining a certain amount of precious metal that Muammar Gaddafi had began to accumulate, and they did. Gold. That was the reason. So again, Russia is not looking at NATO as an immediate threat, but more of an opportunistic threat. So if, from Russia's standpoint, if something internally were to occur, quite possibly by Western intervention inside of Russia, and something happens to the economy, and Russia becomes very, very weak, and you have Ukraine, which is now quite possibly in the future a NATO member. Again, this is hypothetical Russian point of view. Okay, Russia becomes weak again, as it was, let's say, back in '99, post collapse of Soviet Union, based on the opportunistic, aggressive nature that NATO had been operating under. Again, Kosovo, textbook example. Libya, textbook example. Why would not NATO then quite possibly take action against Russia? Not when Russia is strong, but again, an opportunistic operation while Russia is weak. And then how did Russia become weak again? Was it an act of external instigators that are being financed by Western nations? Again, very, very difficult to say. But the whole concept and the whole paradigm in East versus West, communist versus capitalism, has been flipped on its head. In many cases, Russia is more capitalistic than the West now. We're seeing a more intrusive nanny state in the West than in some cases we do and especially in Russia right now. So again, that whole concept has to be taken out because it is not communism versus capitalism. That has been removed. It's something much deeper and expansive than just that point of view. But again, that is Russia's biggest concern right now, is the opportunistic nature of NATO. And to say it is a defensive organization completely to protect Western Europe, you can't say that, because that is simply not true now. NATO has conducted operations outside of the scope of its purview, outside of the scope of its initial reason for existing. And that has Russia's concern, and rightfully so. And then you look at the Ukraine. If you look at the past history in terms of where Ukraine traditionally sat, it has always been part of the Russian sphere of influence, as Belarus. The concept again that if we go back to 1985 and we were to talk about Ukraine being admitted into NATO, would have been a farce. It would have been something that is nonsensical. But here we are, and again, if not for the operations such as Kosovo, Libya, and certain other actions by NATO, quite possibly the admittance of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into NATO, you may not see the concern that you currently see from the Russian Federation. Now, obviously, Russia is not completely the good guy in this, and I hope that I am not making that case. Obviously, one could say that that Putin is semi-authoritarian and is going away from what we would define as a normal Western-style democracy. But with that being said, you also have cause and effect. Is that taking place because of certain actions by the West? And again, there are groups that are funded heavily by Western institutions, Western economies, Western businesses that do seek to overthrow Vladimir Putin. At the same time, you're seeing this encroachment, quite possibly, of Ukraine at some point being accepted into NATO. And again, if you look at the articles of NATO, Ukraine, because of the border disputes and border issues that it has with the Russian Federation, because of the internal conflict that currently exists, probably should not be allowed into NATO. But again, NATO has made exceptions. They've made exceptions both in terms of the defensive nature of the alliance, which became more of an offensive organization. Again, Kosovo. Again, Libya, and some other activities as well. But again, that is the concern of the Russian Federation. And when you hear the mainstream media, NBC News, just the night before last, we're talking about the invasion of Georgia, the 2008 invasion of Georgia by the Russian Federation. So let's look at that in context of what actually occurred. So you had Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, not Dixie, Georgia, Georgia. So if you Kardashian fans believe that I am talking about Dixie, Georgia, go watch the Kardashians. But again, the Republic of Georgia and the Caucasus near southern Russia were not invaded per se by Russia. Georgia went through a civil war, and South Ossetia, this area right here, was had separated from Georgia. It had its own government, as did Abkhazia, this area right here. And they were able to kick out the forces of Georgia during that civil war. And there's been tremendous upheaval in Georgia. But in 2008, under the leadership of Shalikashvili, Georgia decided to make an attempt to retake South Ossetia, that was being also protected with Russian peacekeepers, okay? And Georgia launched a multi-brigade effort to first cut off access by the Roki Tunnel right here, and then launch an operation to seize control of South Ossetia. Again, this area right here. And they attacked Russian peacekeepers. Russia did not attack Georgia. In the initial operation, Georgia attacked South Ossetia. And that is when, once that operation took place by Georgian forces moving into South Ossetia, that is when Russian forces moved into Georgia to secure its base right here. And that is what happened. And that led to additional forces, both Abkhazian and Russian forces, to launch an operation into Georgia. But again, it was not a Russian invasion of Georgia that started the conflict. In fact, it was a Georgian operation into South Ossetia that initiated the conflict. Russia would have never engaged in open conflict if not for those forces of the Georgian military entering South Ossetia. And they absolutely attacked the Russian peacekeeping base in South Ossetia. South Ossetia was separate from Georgia at that time, as was Abkhazia. So again, the concept of this invasion, this premeditated invasion by the Russians into Georgia, is simply a media farce. It did not happen. It was cause and effect. And unfortunately for Georgia and its U.S. and NATO support, it was not ready to engage in open military conflict against the Russian Federation. At the time, they thought they were, but they found themselves in a pickle very quickly, and being militarily defeated. That's when the narrative changed. It went from a Georgian operation to now that Georgia's getting beat by the Russian Federation to an invasion by Russia of Georgia, which was not the case. Again, that is the media spin that occurs and happens. And if you can do the research yourself. If you're versed in what happened in Georgia, obviously you are aware of what happened. But if you turn on NBC, CBS News, CNN, that has been transformed into the Russian invasion of Georgia. Again, not the case. Georgia invaded South Ossetia to retake South Ossetia and found itself in a military conflict with Russia upon doing that. But again, that is the sort of the false narrative that you get on some of these conflicts that we now see between Russia and certain Eastern European states. Again, it is not always as it seems, and is definitely not always as you hear on mainstream media. So do your own research, deep dive into what you're hearing, and validate what you're hearing, because a lot of times what you're hearing is simply untrue. And that's why we're here, Military and Foreign Affairs Network. We are here to shed light on issues and challenges in the world, and bring that knowledge to you. Have a good day, everybody.